What is your darkest family secret? Asterisk A male blood relative went to prison for drug dealing and major theft. Whilst in prison he was diagnosed with Hep C, likely from sharing needles. When he got out of prison, he raped his 13-year-old stepdaughter. There's a high likelihood that he raped his other daughters, one died from a drug overdose and the other committed suicide. He died in prison from Hep C complications and liver cancer. Asterisk A not too distant cousin fucked over his notoriously dangerous bikie gang in a big way, including forcing himself on someone's wife and stealing a high-ups motorbike, and has been on the run for the last 20 years. My uncle killed a guy after finding him with my cousin. My cousin didn't want to seem easy, we're from a conservative country, so she told my uncle that he was trying to rape her. Years later she confessed that she just didn't want my uncle to know she wasn't a virgin. No one in the family talks about it now. Not exactly dark, but I am related to George Washington and Lewis from the Lewis and Clark expedition, which I think is cool. Not too sure about the details though. It's not a secret per se and we have never really been able to confirm it. But my grandfather probably was involved in either the bombing of Dresden or one of the Japanese firebombings. Great man. But that always hurt his soul. If my family has one, they haven't told it to me yet. Maybe I'm my family's dark secret? Really the only bad one I can think of is how my great-grandpa accidentally killed his drill sergeant during a rifle inspection before going to World War II. When our dad died, my mom insisted that we not ask questions or look into it. It turned out that he was murdered in a crime of passion. The lie dissolved the family and my siblings don't know because we don't talk. My sister was given a horse for her birthday when she was young. But shortly after we moved houses. During the move, we left the horse with our granddad till we had our own pasture fenced up. My granddad was a pleasant enough man. But he was a mean drunk. One day the horse jumped his fence while he was day drinking. He took his truck out and instead of walking in back, he tied it to the back of his truck and took the scenic route back home. By the time he got back, the horse's legs and sides had been skinned to hell and had to be put down afterwards. We stopped relations with him for a long while until he got cancer. I learned this after his funeral. My uncle is currently in a relationship with a famous Japanese porn star. Oh. And then there's the time we found a body in the wall of my grandparents' house while we were trying to figure out where a leak was coming from. Turns out my great-grandfather killed around 5 people. Never knew why. Still freaks me out. My GMA had a son out of wedlock. It was a deathbed confession from my GGMA. My GMA would have never told us. My great-grandfather was an alcoholic and drank beer daily while driving to and from work. One day, he was on a gravel road and hit a little girl. She passed away and one of his friends took the blame. I'm not sure why the friend took responsibility, but apparently, my great-grandfather wasn't the same after that. He quit drinking and changed his ways. Multiple parts. 1. My great-grandfather was the illegitimate child of an Italian doctor and was born somewhere in southern Italy. Supposedly the doctor had an affair and to cover it up he sent my great-grandfather to northern Italy as an infant where he became an orphan. 2. As an adult my great-grandfather immigrates to the US where he had multiple children. Mostly women. Who I've been told he sexually abused for the majority of their childhoods. This was not spoken about until the last of his children were on their deathbeds. 3. My great-grandfather's eldest daughter has a child about my mother's age. Her cousin. Who she grew up with. The father of the child is forever kept a secret and never spoken about. But I personally believe that my mother's cousin may be the child of my great-grandfather. 4. My great-grandfather supposedly got involved with the Italian mafia at some point. Robs a bank with 2 other family members, my young grandmother supposedly the getaway driver, and eventually gets caught and all go to prison for a time, with the exception of my grandmother. All are released from prison and all die of natural causes. Supposedly. I just found all of this out about 2 years ago. I'm 33 years old. I cringe. Edit, I cringe. Not only because of what I've told you, but because this was all a secret for decades on decades and previous to the information coming out. My entire family was under the impression that everything and everyone was perfect. How wrong they were. One grandfather abusing all of his daughters. My great-uncle was born from his sister being raped by her father. The family said basically she had just been a loose lady. And not right in the head. They locked her up in the attic. After my great-uncle passed, my mother and I went into the multi-generation house to clean it out. The door to the attic, where sister/mom was kept but long since passed. The door had an outside lock. No creepy claw marks or anything. But it was just so sad. My mom pulled the lock off and announced to the house that she would never be shut away again. My grandma tried to kill my grandpa. My dad tells me that my grandpa was a controlling/emotionally abusive person and never let my grandma go out, even to church. But my dad also doesn't reveal much about the past. All I know is that there's a lot of resentment. Towards the end of his life, my grandpa had a stroke and was completely bedridden and couldn't speak. He was coherent and understood when we spoke to him. We had a full-time carer for him who would bathe him, feed him, etc. Because my grandma didn't want to. As it turns out, she was not giving him or the carer any food. Later we also found out that she wasn't giving him his medicines and would ignore him for hours when he had fits. She would not give him the adult diapers and let him lay in his filth for days. Eventually, my uncle took him in and they took over his care, even though my aunt was recovering from breast cancer. He was doing well and recovered somewhat. My grandma sometimes visited him and asked to be left alone. Once the carer caught her trying to strangle him, and she threatened to call the cops. She just stayed quiet while my uncle kicked her out. This worsened his condition, and he was in the ICU for a while. At some point when she visited him, my grandma had also broken his arm. We didn't know because he couldn't verbally sit. In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service, they get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the hold-up is. When he gets back in, he says, "You won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple. Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple. Atlanta. 1958. She says, "What? Who would do such a thing?" My uncle. That's who. B. Rank, learning that my great-grandfather had sexually abused at least one of his daughters. My great-aunts. Particularly the youngest. His abuse of the youngest resulted in him getting jail time. It was the only time he was punished. This was in the mid-50s. A. Rank, learning that one of these molestations resulted in a pregnancy for the second eldest, which was given up through a closed adoption. This was around 1949. S. Rank, learning that the eldest actually took her father to bed and wanted to be his wife. She saw herself, not her mother, as his real and natural wife for the rest of his life. This was from the late 1940s through his death in 1986. Whether or not a conjugal relationship continued is unknown. But maybe that will be the next thing I learn. My grandparents made a wonderful life for themselves and their children. Those children and their children, my generation, had a great life. Learning about what happened before that was so shocking I can't put it in words. My cousin. Once removed, my parents' cousin, was kidnapped, raped and tortured by a serial killer. She was, after many days, dropped off near a running path with her neck slit. She lived, unlike the other three, and she could lead the police to his home. He is still in prison. As a child I heard whispering of it and didn't find out the whole truth until I was older. Edit, not great aunt. Second cousin. Edit 2, my cousin. Once removed. My great aunt stole my mom and her brother from my grandmother and sold them to an adoption agency and declared them dead. My mother still hasn't found my biological grandmother after 48 years. Though she thinks she did see her once on a visit to Korea. I learned my disabled great-aunt was raped multiple times while she was in high school, including by a teacher, and it resulted in at least 3 pregnancies that she was forced to carry and give up for adoption. And then shamed for. I found out because I did 23andMe and found cousins my dad couldn't explain, so there was a very awful phone call to understand why. My grandmother passed away recently, thinking my uncle passed away from a heart attack 2 years ago. But in reality he shot himself in the head with a 1911. My cousin found his body by accident when she bypassed the note he left by the door to not go into the greenhouse. My great aunt had a thing for this guy. The problem was that this guy happened to be married. That little detail didn't stop my great aunt. So what did she do? Well, she killed the man's wife. Apparently when he went off to work early one morning, she broke into the house and killed the woman by sawing her off head. Then she cleaned up the mess, buried the body in the backyard, tidied the house up, cooked dinner and waited for the man to come home. When he got home he noticed the house was a bit different. Out comes my great to greet him. This was the first time the man had met my great aunt. And what did this man do? Well, he thought it was a great gesture of love. They called the police and he covered up for my great aunt's crime. Says he did it. He gets arrested and spends a couple of years in prison and then bribes his way out. He moves into his old home with my great aunt and they had a happy marriage for over 40 years later until he passed away from natural causes. Back in the 70s my grandfather was actually an Indian soldier stationed near Bhutan border. Now he was going to the market with my dad, /5 years old, and my aunt, /8-9y/0. And it was a crowded place so they all just kind of followed each other. But when he got back home he only had my dad behind him. Then he went back the route only to see some priest taking away my aunt. Apparently it was for a ritual. A ritual of human sacrifice and they just randomly picked up my aunt. Grandpa took her back and settled back in a safer place in inner India. Thanks for watching.